Welcome everyone, StealthyShiroean here, and today I'm bringing you my review of the Humble Choice bundle for February 2025. Maybe a bit weaker of a month overall, but it had a couple pleasant surprises for me and how fun they were, but I also surprised myself with how I stacked them up in the final recommendations. Before I get too ahead of myself though, let me know what you think of this month's bundle in the comments below. Be sure to check the timestamps for specific games and stay tuned for my final thoughts in the end. Okay, let's get to the review. Starting off the review, we have My Little Universe, which is something. I'm not really sure what to call this genre. I guess it's a crafting style of game. Essentially, My Little Universe distills the gathering and crafting aspects of a survival crafting game and turns it into a simple and approachable title. I think many will either love the game because of its simplicity, or they're gonna find it boring. Somehow, I was the former, and I enjoyed what I played despite not thinking I would. Although, I don't know I'd be committed to playing the game through to completion. And that's because the game has a player gathering resources so you could create land, to find new resources, to create land, to find new resources, and so on and so forth. In between all that, there are upgrade stations you can use, assuming you have the material to make your tools more efficient at resource gathering, and there are other various interactable things that take resources as well, such as a portal to travel to other worlds, to gather resources, and, yep, you guessed it, create land. This all probably sounds really grindy. And yeah, it did feel that way. I imagine the feeling will become even stronger as you progress in the game. However, there was something so satisfying about getting that next resource or upgrade or setting new piece of land. I don't get it, but obviously these devs do. Additionally, you can list the aid of up to 3 other friends to play or commiserate together depending on everyone's preference for these kinds of games. Next up is Naheulbeuk's Dungeon Master, which is a dungeon management simulation game. A few years back, September 2022 to be precise, we received the dungeon in Naheulbeuk, the Amulet of Chaos, which was a tactical turn-based strategy where you delve into the dungeon as a group of adventurers. Well, now we're playing the opposite of that. In Dungeon Master, players plan out their own dungeons in order to stop adventurers from getting out alive. Or, well, you would, but it's also a management game as well. Apparently, you need to also keep minions happy and provide them with luxuries so they don't go on strike. And you need to pay them as well as be able to afford expanding the dungeon, adding rooms, etc. Overall, the gameplay was okay, but I thought it was strange that I spent so much time on the management side rather than actually building out a dungeon filled with traps and monsters to stop foolhardy adventurers. In my hour, I started the campaign, which acted more as a tutorial, at least in the beginning, and only had been raided once by wannabe heroes. Instead, I was completely hard-stopped by needing to raise prestige in the different rooms I had in order to improve my dungeon's reputation level. This took up a decent chunk of time and consisted of me placing the same few decorative items in every single room. Similarly to the other aforementioned game, the setting and characters don't take themselves seriously. It's a humorful story with hit-or-miss jokes. Actually, it didn't bother me as much this time around as it did when I played the other game years back, but I haven't touched it since then, so I barely remember it. Personally, nothing about this game really seemed that special to me. I've never played the Dungeons franchise, but I'd imagine it's fairly similar, and in fact, that may be the better choice. No idea, but I don't know how keen I am to bother playing this again. Tales and Tactics is an auto-battler roguelike where creating effective synergies between your chosen units is the name of the game. I'm not the biggest fan when it comes to auto-battlers, mainly because I like to have more control in what's happening in a strategy game, but I can't deny that this one wasn't too bad. In each run, you play a series of rounds where you pit your fighters against the opponents. There are several different fighters to buy in between rounds, each with their own special abilities and passive traits. If you buy multiples of the same fighter, then they can merge together to make them stronger. Additionally, if you have multiple fighters with the same traits, then you can gain more passive buffs. However, you're limited in the number of fighters you could have on the board as well as in your hand, so players need to choose wisely with their purchases. I won't lie, but with all the different unit skills, traits, buffs, etc., it's kind of overwhelming. Luckily, the game is very transparent with information. It was really easy to find what certain things meant, what buffs you had, or what each unit could do. Trying to find potential combinations, on the other hand, is up to the skill of the player, but at least the game makes it a bit easier to figure out. One thing about the game that I didn't really get is the board. There didn't seem to be much of a point since you couldn't control the action or manipulate the board in any way. The only thing I could see was putting melee fighters up front and ranged fighters in the back, which felt basic. I think the game is solid and has an audience for it, however the complexity does kinda scare me off because I think it probably would take a lot of time and experience with the game to understand what makes the right combinations. At the same time, the matches are quick, so it might be worth jumping in for a few as a game to play on the side. Griftlands is another roguelike, but this time of the deck building variety. Set in a harsh sci-fi world, players begin the game with the first of three characters, Sal, a bounty hunter trying to get on their feet and get revenge. And it's here that the game really pulled me in. You see, in Griftlands, they place a heavier emphasis on storytelling and the choices the players make throughout the campaign. Different characters can change their disposition towards you depending on your actions. Players can visit different locales, which make things feel more open compared to largely linear paths roguelites tend to use, with slight choices for changes in rewards or avoiding a difficult battle. Griftlands felt more like an RPG rather than a deck builder roguelite in that sense. However, the card combat is here and it comes in two different flavors. The first is a fairly standard fight that we've seen before in other games like this. You take turns doing actions and trying to counter the enemy's actions until their health drops to 0. Or not, because each enemy also has a panic value that if it drops to 0, they'll run. You could also choose to execute enemies or accept surrender, which can further alter the course of how others perceive you, which is cool. The second kind of combat is a battle of negotiation. You have to convince someone of something. It's similar to physical combat, but the targets you need to tackle are arguments. If you manage to whittle down their resolve on their main argument, then they'll concede and you'll win the negotiation. Griftlands was fun and brought some unique concepts to the deck-building roguelike genre that has really piqued my interest. The writing was also decent, and I wanted to learn more about the unique world as well as the characters. I'm unsure how in-depth any of it will end up being, but I'm definitely interested in playing this one in the near future. Following up is Fabledom, a city builder set in a fantasy world of fables. The world design here is cute and inviting. There's a lot of charm in the visuals from the characters to the buildings. It sets the tone of a game as something that is fairly laid back. And that's exactly how it plays. The gameplay felt rather simple. It might be similar to what I said earlier about My Little Universe. Simple enough that could be what attracts a player, but also what could act as a deterrent. In my time with the game, I was virtually never in danger of upsetting my people or running out of resources. I did have one winter where I ran completely out of food and got some pity help from a neighboring kingdom. I'm not sure if this was something that always happened or if it was because it's the beginning of the game. There are supposed to be other aspects of the game such as combat and a relation system, as in your character gets married to someone else, but I didn't get far enough to experience these systems. Despite this, as mentioned, everything felt laid back, perhaps a bit too much. I had my game running at full speed most of the time, and I still felt like I was waiting around for things to get done. Overall, Fabledom seems like a solid, slow-paced experience, but if I'm being completely honest, it also felt kind of bland. Total War Pharaoh, for those unfamiliar with the franchise, is a turn-based strategy game with real-time tactical battles. Each game has its own time period, well, the historical ones anyway, and this one is set in Egypt and the greater area during the Bronze Age collapse. Although this one might be a bit confusing because you get Total War Pharaoh and Total War Pharaoh Dynasties. Well, Dynasties was a huge free update they made for the game, and I guess made it as its own separate title in your Steam library. It greatly expands on the map, adding in Greece and Mesopotamia, as well as adding some associated factions, each with different leaders, and a bunch of minor factions you could play as. Essentially, it creates an expansive Bronze Age world to fight in, similar to other Total War titles of the past. So, is there any reason to play the base game? Well, I was curious about that too, and apparently if you want a more focused campaign on purely the Egyptian and Hittite empires, then the base game is your jam. Some other differences, but largely, Dynasties just expands on everything the base game already had. And while I was already interested in playing Total War Pharaoh, the Dynasties update really got me excited for the game. But how is the game? Well, if you haven't played a Total War game before, I can see this as being a bit overwhelming. There is a tutorial, but I can't attest to how good it is since I just jumped into the game. I've had years of experience playing almost all the Total War titles, so I didn't think it was necessary. There's a lot though, with a bunch of different resources, a huge web-like tech tree, or royal decrees as they're called. Then there's a bunch of different buildings and outposts to make, units to produce, and of course the huge map, or extra huge if you're playing dynasties. It can all be a bit too much. I usually find myself just trying to center in on a few things at a time though. Don't take in the big picture and you'll be fine. Unfortunately, an hour with a game like this isn't nearly enough for me to tell you how it compares to other Total War games. It was enough for me to get into a couple of super easy battles, make a few buildings, and click end turn around half a dozen times. Although, as a historical Total War fan, I'm super happy to get my hands on this. I've played almost all the Total War games, and most of the ones featuring a multiplayer campaign I've played with a good friend. So we're already looking forward to being able to tackle this at some point in the hopeful near future. The penultimate game of the bundle is Trepang 2, a fast-paced shooter that is, in fact, not actually a sequel. Apparently, it was the codename for the devs' second game or something like that, with their first one being called Trepang and having nothing to do with the current game in question. You play as some sort of experiment that breaks out of a facility with the help of some organization in order to stop some other organization. It's all kind of unclear since it's the beginning of the game. There are also notes you can collect, but really, I didn't care about any of that. The gameplay was top-notch. You can cloak, go into bullet time, as well as your character having super strength. The action is fast and frenetic. It reminded me a lot of Crysis moving in between the different modes the nanosuit has in that game. I greatly enjoyed it. Being able to sneak up on people and then snap their necks was immensely satisfying. And the ability to go into bullet time when things got too hectic really helped with trying to manage a quickly overwhelming situation. The enemy AI seemed fairly smart as well, as they would try to root me out. Of course, I could stealth, which, once again, made those kills so satisfying. Every now and again, I get genuinely surprised by a title, and this month it was Trepang 2. I completely expected some sort of dead or dying multiplayer shooter at first glance, but instead got a game with a solid campaign and excellent gameplay. Definitely will be coming back to this one. The main headliner for the month is Immortals of Aveum, a first-person shooter with some decent world building. Aveum is a fantasy world with an interesting take on magic, since magic is infused in all facets of the society. Visually, I thought the game was good, and I liked the set piece for the city of Saren in the beginning of the game, which was a city built on a large bridge hanging over the so-called Wound, which was some sort of magical abyss. Immortals is a very cinematic heavy game, at least from what I could tell from the beginning. The voice acting and motion capture was decent, and I thought the characters were fun.
Is that your definition of being carefuler?
Whoops.
What are we gonna do with it? Wiggle at it, Caleb?
Maybe?
What do you mean, maybe? Uh-oh.
They do feel a bit stereotypical and don't stand out too much yet, and so far the game thrusts you into a Chosen One storyline where the narrative kills everyone the main character knows, so they have this fresh start with these newfound powers. Again, it's all fine, but it doesn't really stand out. Combat itself felt like a shooter, really. Yes, you're technically using spells, but the blue spell felt like a rifle, the red felt like a shotgun, and the green felt like some sort of SMG. It felt familiar, which I guess is good, but I also was expecting something a bit crazier since we're dealing with magic here. Maybe that comes later? It would be cool to have unique combinations and the ability to discover these on your own, similar to a system like in the Magicka games for those familiar with them. I didn't get too far in my hour, but the story and world building was enough to make me interested in picking it back up. As far as it goes solely as a shooter, well, I'm not expecting anything special, but as long as it's fun, then I suppose that doesn't matter. Okay, let's wrap this up and see if this bundle is worth it or not. I based my rating solely on whether I thought the game was worth playing on about an hour or so of hands-on gameplay. Also, I'd be grateful if you could please give the video a like if you're enjoying it, because that really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm gods. Overall, well, as I said in the beginning of the video, this month has some weaker titles, but for me, it made it up with some really good ones. I think the biggest stinker is that we got an EA key for Immortals of Aveum. I know in practice it doesn't matter that much, but I like having Steam keys since it's the only launcher I use regularly. I suppose I don't mind it so much if the game is exclusive to a platform and it isn't on Steam, but that isn't the case with Immortals. So, raise the pitchforks and all that. Anyway, let's get to the recommendations, starting with the must-plays, and this month I selected 2 games, which are Trepang 2 and Griftlands. Both of these were surprisingly good games. Trepang 2 was an enjoyable shooter that controlled great and felt really satisfying. It's amazing that such a small studio, supposedly only 4 members, made something so top-notch. Griftlands was another game that took me by surprise. I mean, seriously, what? A deck builder roguelike making it into my must-plays? It sounds crazy to me, and maybe to some of you who know my gaming preferences. But yeah, Griftlands was just a fun game that had some unique concepts for a deck builder. In the strong recommendations, I placed Total War Pharaoh and Immortals of Aveum. This was probably the biggest surprise, but I fully expected to put Pharaoh down as a must-play before I even started the review. And I think this is where my hour with a game kinda doesn't work. It simply wasn't enough time to get a good feel for the game, but knowing my own experience with the franchise and my own eagerness to play the game, I'm putting this up there as something to recommend because I think I would recommend almost any of the Total Wars. Yeah, some are better than others, but I never came across one that was downright bad. Immortals of Aveum was a solid game, good visuals, and a decent if derivative story. The gameplay seems like it could be more imaginative, but I'm hoping that comes later in the game. My week recommendations are My Little Universe and Tales and Tactics. My Little Universe had a surprisingly addicting gameplay loop. I don't usually like the endless gathering grind in survival crafting games, and maybe I'd get bored of it with My Little Universe. However, so far it's been done well enough to make me want to get that next resource and create that next bit of land. Tales and Tactics was a fun auto-battler with some roguelite elements. I liked it, but the overall complexity seemed like it might be a bit too much for me. In my Don't Bother With section, I placed Fabledom and Naheulbeuk's Dungeon Master. Admittedly, I thought about putting the both of them in week recommendations with a caveat since neither one felt like a bad game, but I ultimately decided to place them here. And the main reason is that I don't see myself coming back to either game and didn't really have that much fun playing either. Dungeon Master felt slow to get to the parts that I would want to see in a game where I'm building out my own dungeon. Fabledom, while charming, also felt slow to the point that I had the game set to the fastest possible speed and still found myself waiting for things to happen or get done. Do you agree with my thoughts? What games, if any, are you looking forward to playing? Let me know what your thoughts are, or if there are any different recommendations you'd make in the comments below. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.